Give us $40,000 for your sister's house, or don't sit with the family," my mother said with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, right there on a perfect stretch of Cape Cod sand where the ocean shimmered like something out of a postcard and my younger sister stood barefoot in a white linen dress waiting to become someone's wife. And for a moment I thought I must have misheard her because everything around me was so beautiful, so carefully arranged, that cruelty didn't seem like it could belong there, not between the soft violin music drifting through the air and the neat rows of white chairs tied with pale blue ribbons, not under an arch woven with baby's breath and eucalyptus, not on a day that was supposed to be about love. But then I saw the way she tilted her head, the way her lips curved just slightly as if she had rehearsed that line and was pleased with how it landed, and I knew she meant every word of it. I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding or a poorly timed joke. This was a demand, deliberate and calculated, delivered in the middle of a wedding as if I were nothing more than an item on a checklist that still needed to be paid for, and I stood there holding the small clutch I had chosen to match my light blue dress, feeling suddenly out of place in a way I couldn't quite explain, like I had shown up to the wrong event, or stepped into a scene that had been written without me in mind. And I glanced toward the front where Melissa was, laughing with her bridesmaids, her hair catching the sunlight just right, her happiness glowing so brightly it almost made the rest of this moment feel unreal. But it wasn't unreal, because when I looked back at my mother, she was still watching me, waiting, her expression calm, almost expectant, as if what she had just asked was the most natural thing in the world. As if a daughter being told to hand over $40,000 at her sister's wedding was simply part of how families worked. And I realized then that this hadn't started today, it had only reached its most public form. Because for years, quietly and without much resistance, I had been the one who made things easier, the one who stepped in when Melissa needed help, when bills piled up, when something went wrong and someone had to fix it, and each time I told myself it was temporary, that families support each other, that it was easier for me than for her, that it was the right thing to do, and maybe that was true once. But standing there on that beach with the wind tugging lightly at my dress and the sound of waves rolling in steady and indifferent, it didn't feel like support anymore, it felt like expectation, like obligation carved into something deeper than reason, and I opened my mouth to respond but no words came out right away, because I wasn't sure which part of this I was supposed to answer first, the amount, the timing, or the quiet threat hidden at the end of her sentence, "Don't sit with the family," and I followed her gaze without meaning to, noticing for the first time that the seating had been arranged differently than I remembered from the invitation that the front row held. My mother, Melissa, and a cluster of relatives who had always orbited closer to her than to me, and that my name wasn't where it should have been, wasn't among them, but placed a few rows back with distant cousins and acquaintances who would smile politely but wouldn't ask questions, and something inside me shifted then, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, steady change, like a door quietly closing. And I thought about the rehearsal dinner I had paid for 2 nights before, about the plane ticket I had booked for my mother so she wouldn't have to deal with connections, about the envelope in my purse containing a wedding gift I had chosen carefully, thoughtfully, because I believed this day mattered, because I believed showing up mattered, and yet here I was being told that none of that counted, that none of it was enough, that what mattered was one more number, one more transfer. One more silent agreement to keep things running the way they always had, and I realized I was tired, not in a way that could be fixed with rest, but in a way that comes from understanding something you've been avoiding for too long. And still, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue, I didn't draw attention, because that wasn't who I had ever been. Instead I let out a small breath, adjusted the strap of my clutch, and looked back at my mother with a calm I didn't entirely feel, knowing that whatever happened next would not be decided by the ocean, or the music, or the ceremony waiting to begin. It would be decided by whether I finally chose to stop being the person they expected me to be. I did not answer my mother right away because the ceremony was about to begin, and the music had shifted into something softer, something that made everyone turn their attention toward the aisle, and I found myself moving almost automatically toward the side, stepping out of the path as guests rose from their chairs and the ocean breeze lifted the edges of dresses and jackets in a way that looked effortless and cinematic, as if the entire afternoon had been designed for a photograph rather than lived by real people with complicated histories, and I stood there watching my sister take her place at the end of the aisle, her face glowing with anticipation, her hands steady as she held her bouquet, and for a brief moment I let myself focus only on that, on the idea that despite everything, this was still a wedding, still a milestone, still a day that should have belonged entirely to her happiness. But even as I tried to hold on to that thought, I could feel the weight of what had just been said settling somewhere deeper inside me, not sharp and immediate, but heavy and persistent, like something that had been building for years and had finally found its way into the open air where it could no longer be ignored. And as the officiant began to speak and the guests settled into a quiet attentiveness, I became aware of small details I might have missed before. The way a few relatives glanced in my direction and then quickly looked away, the way my mother had already taken her seat in the front row without once checking whether I would follow, the way there was a subtle but unmistakable gap where I would have been expected to sit, and I realized then that this moment had been arranged long before I arrived, that the conversation on the sand was not spontaneous but simply the final step in something that had already been decided, and that realization brought with it a kind of clarity that was both unsettling and strangely grounding, because it meant that the confusion I had felt earlier was not a failure on my part to understand the situation, but a natural response to being placed inside a narrative that I had not agreed to. And as the vows began, I found myself drifting into memory without meaning to, back to the months leading up to this day, back to the phone calls, where Melissa's voice had been light and enthusiastic as she described venues and flowers and menus, back to the way she had said she wanted everything to feel intimate and meaningful, back to the moment she had asked if I could help with the rehearsal dinner because things were getting tight, and I had said yes without hesitation because that was what I had always done. I had said yes when it was smaller amounts, when it was framed as temporary, when it was wrapped in gratitude that felt genuine enough at the time, and each yes had seemed reasonable on its own, each one easy to justify, but standing there now, listening to promises being made in front of family and friends, I could see how those moments had connected, how they had formed a pattern that led directly to this one, where the request was no longer softened or disguised but stated plainly, publicly, with an expectation of compliance. And I wondered if anyone else could see it, if anyone else understood that what looked like a simple family dynamic from the outside was, in reality, something much more complicated, something that had been quietly reinforced over years until it became invisible to everyone except the person living inside it, and I felt a brief flicker of something that might have been embarrassment, or might have been something else entirely, something closer to recognition, and I shifted my weight slightly. The sand beneath my shoes uneven and warm, grounding me in the present moment, and I let my gaze move across the gathering, taking in the faces of people who had known me for decades and those who barely knew me at all, and I realized that regardless of what they believed or assumed, this was the point where something had to change, not because of the money itself, although the number was not insignificant, but because of what agreeing would mean, because it would confirm a version of me that I was no longer sure I could continue to be. And as the ceremony reached its quiet conclusion and the first round of applause began to rise, I did not join in immediately, not out of defiance, but because I was still standing in that space between who I had been and who I might become, and when I finally did bring my hands together, the sound felt distant, almost detached, as if it belonged to someone else entirely, and I knew that whatever came next would not be resolved with a simple answer or a quick conversation. It would require something more deliberate, something that could not be undone once it was set in motion, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I might not give them what they were asking for, not now, not later, not at all. The applause faded into the sound of chairs shifting and quiet conversations rising again, and just like that the ceremony was over and everyone began moving toward the reception area set a little further up the beach where round tables had been arranged under a wide white tent, and I followed along at a measured pace, not because I was eager to join but because standing still any longer would have drawn attention I was not ready to invite. And as I approached the seating chart displayed on a wooden easel near the entrance I already knew what I would find, but I looked anyway, tracing the neatly printed names with a calm I did not quite feel until I found mine positioned at table 7, near the edge of the tent, far from the head table where my mother and Melissa would be seated, and there was something almost precise about it, not careless, not accidental, but intentional in a way that confirmed what had been implied earlier without needing to be said again, and I felt a brief tightening in my chest before it passed, replaced by a steadier awareness that I was seeing things clearly now in a way I had not allowed myself to before, and I picked up my place card from the small tray beneath the chart, turning it over in my fingers as if it might reveal something different on the other side, but it was just my name in elegant script, nothing more, nothing less, and I slipped it into my clutch before walking further into the tent where guests were already taking their seats, laughter filling the space in warm bursts that contrasted sharply with the quiet distance I felt inside. And when I reached table 7, I found it occupied by a mix of distant relatives and acquaintances, people who greeted me politely but without the familiarity that might have made the moment easier, and I returned their smiles, taking my seat and smoothing my dress over my knees as I settled in, aware of how composed I must appear from the outside, as if everything were exactly as it should be, and for a while I focused on the small things. The way the sunlight filtered through the fabric of the tent, casting soft patterns on the tables, the arrangement of flowers in the centerpieces, the gentle clink of glasses as servers moved between guests offering drinks, all of it carefully designed to create a sense of ease and celebration, and yet beneath that surface I could feel the undercurrent of something else, something that had already begun to shift, and it was not long before Daniel found me, his expression more serious than I had seen it earlier in the day. And he pulled out the chair beside me without asking, leaning slightly closer so that his voice would not carry beyond our table, and there was a steadiness in his tone that immediately told me this was not a casual observation but something he had been holding on to, something he felt I needed to hear, and when he spoke, it was direct in a way that cut through the lingering uncertainty I had been trying to navigate. He said that people had been talking, that he had overheard Melissa speaking with a group near the bar, casually mentioning that I had already committed to contributing a significant amount toward a new home, that it had been part of the plan all along, framed as something generous and expected, not as a request or even a discussion, but as a fact that everyone seemed to accept without question. And as I listened, I felt that same quiet shift deepen into something more defined, not anger exactly, but clarity, because this was no longer about a single conversation on the beach or a poorly timed demand. This was a narrative that had been constructed and shared in my absence, a story in which my role had been decided for me without my knowledge or consent, and I asked Daniel how long this had been going on. And he hesitated for just a moment before answering that he had only started noticing it recently, that at first it had sounded like assumptions or misunderstandings, but now it was being repeated with enough confidence that it no longer felt accidental, and I nodded slowly, taking in his words while keeping my expression composed, aware that the people around us were engaged in their own conversations, unaware of the quiet unraveling taking place at our table. And I glanced toward the head table where Melissa was seated beside Grant, her posture relaxed, her smile bright as she spoke with the guests closest to her, and for a moment I studied her face, searching for any sign that she might feel the weight of what had been set in motion, but there was nothing there to suggest hesitation or doubt, only the ease of someone who believed everything was unfolding exactly as intended, and I realized then that whatever came next would not be a matter of correcting a misunderstanding. It would require me to step outside of the role I had been given and to do so in a way that could not be quietly dismissed or reinterpreted, and I looked back at Daniel, offering a small nod that was more a signal to myself than to him, a recognition that the time for uncertainty had passed and that what remained was a choice, one that would shape not only the rest of this day but everything that followed. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with a kind of careful precision that only made everything feel more deliberate, as if every detail had been placed exactly where it needed to be to support a version of events that did not include my consent, and I remained at table 7 through the first course and into the second, listening more than speaking, nodding when appropriate, allowing the rhythm of polite conversation to carry me along while my thoughts moved in a quieter, more focused direction, and every so often I would hear my name mentioned from another table, always in the same tone, always paired with words like generous and supportive, and I began to understand just how far the story had traveled, how thoroughly it had been shared. Because people who had not spoken to me in years were now smiling at me with a kind of appreciative familiarity, as if they believed they already knew something important about me, something I had never actually said, and I found myself wondering how many versions of this conversation had taken place before today, how many times my supposed promise had been repeated and accepted without question, and when the plates were cleared and the servers moved quietly between tables refilling glasses and adjusting silverware. I noticed a small stack of printed programs placed near the centerpieces, something I had not paid attention to earlier, and almost without thinking I reached for one, unfolding it slowly as if I expected it to confirm what I was beginning to suspect, and there it was, near the back page beneath a list of acknowledgments, a line that read special thanks to Eleanor Whitaker for her generous contribution toward Melissa and Grant's future home, and I stared at the words for a moment longer than necessary. Not because I was surprised anymore, but because seeing it in print carried a different weight, something more permanent, something that could be pointed to and referenced as proof, and I felt Daniel shift slightly beside me, his attention following mine as he read the same line, and when he looked up at me there was no confusion in his expression, only a quiet confirmation that what we had both begun to understand was now undeniable, and I closed the program carefully, smoothing the crease with my thumb before setting it back down on the table, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to sit with the full scope of what had been done, not just the conversation on the beach, not just the comments shared among guests, but the printed acknowledgement that had been distributed to everyone in attendance, something that suggested not only expectation but certainty, and it was in that moment that the last traces of hesitation slipped away, replaced by a steadiness that felt unfamiliar at first but quickly settled into something I recognized as resolve, and I lifted my glass of water, taking a small sip as I let my gaze move once more toward the head table where Melissa was laughing at something Grant had said, her posture relaxed, her confidence unshaken, and I wondered if she believed I would remain quiet, if she assumed that I would follow the same pattern I always had, stepping in at the last moment to smooth things over, to ensure that nothing disrupted the image she had created, and the thought might have unsettled me earlier, but now it simply clarified what needed to be done, because this was no longer a private matter that could be addressed quietly after the fact, it had been made public, presented as truth, and that meant any response would have to be just as visible, just as clear, and I turned slightly toward Daniel, my voice low but steady as I told him that I understood now, that I saw the full picture, and he nodded in return, not asking questions, not offering advice, simply acknowledging that whatever decision I made would come from a place that had finally been fully informed, and as the room began to shift again in preparation for the next part of the reception, the speeches that would soon follow, I felt a calm settle over me that was different from the composure I had been maintaining earlier. This was not about appearances anymore, it was about intention, and as I folded my hands lightly in my lap and listened to the sound of a microphone being tested near the front of the tent, I knew that the moment I had been moving toward all afternoon was about to arrive, and this time I would not step back or remain silent, not because I wanted to disrupt anything, but because allowing this version of the story to stand unchallenged would mean accepting a role that no longer belonged to me. The microphone let out a brief, sharp hum before settling into a steady tone, and the low murmur of conversation across the tent softened as people turned their attention toward the front where Melissa's maid of honor had just finished speaking, her voice still lingering in the air with laughter and sentiment, and I watched as glasses were lifted, smiles exchanged, the atmosphere warm and effortless in a way that would have seemed comforting if not for the quiet tension that had been building inside me all afternoon, and when the next speaker was announced, my mother rose from her seat with the same composed grace she had carried through every social gathering I could remember, her posture straight, her expression serene, as if she were stepping into a role she had perfected over decades, and as she reached the microphone she glanced briefly toward me, not long enough to draw attention, but just enough to remind me that she was aware of exactly where I was sitting, and I felt Daniel shift beside me again, his presence steady, grounding, as we both listened. And my mother began to speak in a voice that carried easily across the tent, warm and measured, recounting stories from Melissa's childhood, highlighting her resilience, her charm, her ability to bring people together, and the guests responded as expected, with soft laughter and nods of agreement, drawn into the narrative she was crafting, and for a moment I allowed myself to observe it as if from a distance, recognizing the skill in the way she guided the room. The way she built a sense of shared history and affection, and then, almost seamlessly, she shifted the focus, her tone becoming slightly more reflective as she spoke about family support and the importance of showing up for one another in meaningful ways, and I felt the air around me tighten just slightly, as if the room itself sensed a change that had not yet been fully revealed. And then she said my name, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that every head turned in my direction. And she smiled in a way that suggested gratitude, as if she were offering recognition rather than expectation, and she spoke about my generosity, about how I had always been there for Melissa, about how I continued to support her even now as she began this new chapter, and there was a pause, just long enough for the implication to settle, and I could feel the weight of those words pressing outward, shaping the way everyone in that tent understood what had already been decided, and I realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when the story would be reinforced publicly, when any doubt would be replaced with certainty, and for a brief second I considered what would happen if I remained still. If I allowed the speech to continue uninterrupted, if I let the narrative complete itself without resistance, and I knew exactly what that would look like. It would look like agreement, like acceptance, like another quiet confirmation that the role they had written for me was one I would continue to play, and the thought did not bring fear or anger, only a clear understanding of consequence. And as my mother's voice carried on, weaving gratitude and expectation into something that sounded almost indistinguishable from one another, I felt a calm settle over me that was different from anything I had felt earlier, not the composure of politeness, not the restraint of uncertainty, but something firmer, something rooted in the decision that had already been made within me, and I placed my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, anchoring myself in the present moment. And when my mother gestured gently in my direction as if inviting acknowledgement, I did not lower my gaze or offer a small, agreeable smile the way I might have in the past. Instead, I met her eyes directly from across the room, holding that connection just long enough for her to recognize that something had shifted, that the familiar pattern she relied on was no longer intact, and I saw it then, just for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty beneath her composed exterior, quickly masked but not entirely gone. And I knew that whatever happened next would not unfold the way she had planned, because this time I was not going to follow the script that had been written for me, and as the final lines of her speech approached, and the room prepared to respond with applause, I felt the quiet certainty of what I was about to do settle fully into place, not rushed, not impulsive, but deliberate in a way that left no room for hesitation, and I waited, not for permission, not for the right moment to be given to me, but for the moment I would choose myself. The applause began before my mother even stepped away from the microphone, a warm, approving sound that filled the tent and seemed to confirm everything she had just said as truth, and for a brief moment I remained still, letting that sound settle around me, letting it reach its full volume before I moved, because timing mattered now in a way it had not before. And when I finally stood up from my seat at table 7, it was not abrupt or dramatic, it was measured, deliberate, the kind of movement that does not demand attention but inevitably draws it anyway, and I could feel Daniel rise slightly beside me as if to follow, but I gave the smallest shake of my head, not to push him away but to let him know that this was something I needed to do on my own, and I stepped away from the table, smoothing my dress as I moved, my heels pressing gently into the sand-covered flooring beneath the tent. Each step steady and unhurried as I made my way toward the front, and at first only a few people noticed, their conversations quieting mid-sentence, their eyes following me with mild curiosity. But as I continued forward, the shift spread, like a ripple moving outward, until the room began to settle into a different kind of silence, one that was not planned or guided by a host but created by the simple awareness that something unexpected was about to happen. And when I reached the space near the microphone my mother had just vacated, I paused briefly, not because I was uncertain but because I wanted to be fully present in that moment, to feel the weight of it without rushing past it, and then I turned slightly, positioning myself so that I could see both the head table and the rows of guests behind it, and I let my gaze move across the room, meeting eyes where they met mine, not challenging, not defensive, simply steady, and I became aware of how quiet it had grown. How even the soft background music had faded into something barely noticeable, and in that stillness I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly enough that every word carried, and I said that I appreciated the kind things that had been said about me, that I understood how much today meant to Melissa and how important it was for everyone to feel supported, and I allowed a small pause, just enough to let those words settle in a way that felt genuine, because they were, and then I continued, my tone unchanged. My posture relaxed, as I explained that there had been a misunderstanding, that while I had always cared deeply about my family and had contributed in many ways over the years, I had not agreed to provide the amount that had been mentioned, and I saw it then, the subtle shift in the room, the way expressions changed almost imperceptibly, the way people leaned slightly forward as if trying to determine whether they had heard correctly, and I did not rush to fill that space. I let it remain for a moment, because it was important that the words stood on their own, that they were not softened or redirected, and then I added, just as calmly, that I believed it was important for things like this to be discussed privately and honestly, rather than assumed or presented as fact, and I could feel the attention sharpening now, no longer casual, no longer passive, and I glanced briefly toward Melissa, whose smile had faltered just enough to reveal the tension beneath it, and toward my mother, whose composure remained intact but whose stillness carried a different kind of focus, and I did not linger on either of them for long, because this was not about confronting them directly in that moment, it was about correcting something that had been allowed to take shape without my voice, and when I finished speaking I did not add anything further, I did not justify or elaborate, I simply inclined my head slightly, a small, respectful gesture that acknowledged the room as a whole. And then I stepped back from the microphone, turning without haste and walking back toward my table, and as I did I could feel the atmosphere shifting again, the earlier certainty replaced by something more uncertain, more questioning, and I returned to my seat with the same quiet composure I had carried forward, aware that whatever followed would unfold on its own now, no longer directed solely by the expectations that had been placed on me, but shaped by the simple fact that I had spoken for myself in a space where I had previously remained silent. When I sat back down at table 7, the silence did not break immediately, it lingered in a way that felt heavier than before, as if the entire room needed a moment to adjust to what had just happened, and I reached for my glass again, taking a small, steady sip of water not because I needed it but because the familiar motion grounded me, and beside me Daniel exhaled quietly, not in relief exactly but in recognition, as though something that had been building for a long time had finally found its release, and around us conversations began to return in fragments, low voices picking up where they had left off but with a different tone now, more careful, more measured, and I noticed how some guests avoided looking in my direction, while others glanced over with a kind of cautious curiosity, trying to reconcile what they had just heard with what they had previously believed, and I did not engage with any of it. I did not offer explanations or reassurance, I simply remained where I was, allowing the space to exist without trying to fill it, and after a few moments the music resumed, slightly louder than before, as if someone had decided that normalcy could be restored by turning up the volume, and servers began moving again, clearing plates and bringing out the next course with professional composure, their expressions neutral in a way that suggested they had seen moments like this before. Moments where something unplanned shifted the atmosphere but did not stop the event from continuing. And I could feel my mother's presence before I saw her, the subtle change in the air as she approached our table, her steps controlled, her posture unchanged, and when she stopped beside me she did not sit, she remained standing, just close enough that her voice could reach me without carrying beyond the immediate space, and she said my name in the same tone she had used countless times before, calm, measured, but now edged with something firmer. Something that expected compliance even after what had just taken place, and I turned my head slightly to meet her gaze, not rising, not shifting away, simply acknowledging her presence, and for a brief moment neither of us spoke, the pause stretching just long enough to reveal that this was not a spontaneous conversation but a continuation of something that had already been set in motion. And when she did speak again, her words were quiet but precise. She said that there had been no need to correct anything publicly, that matters like this could have been handled differently, that I had created unnecessary confusion on a day that was meant to be simple and joyful, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed but because I understood that this was how she framed things. That from her perspective the issue was not the assumption itself but the fact that I had challenged it in front of others, and when she finished I let a small pause settle between us before responding, keeping my voice even, matching her tone rather than escalating it, and I said that clarity was important, that when something had been presented publicly it required a public response, not as a form of confrontation but as a way of ensuring that everyone understood the same truth, and I saw the slight tightening in her expression, the brief shift that suggested she had not expected that answer, and she inhaled slowly, as if preparing to redirect the conversation back to familiar ground, but this time the usual path was not there, and she asked, more directly now, whether I intended to contribute at all, whether there was still a possibility that I would reconsider once things had settled, and the question might have felt pressing earlier, might have carried a weight that made it difficult to answer, but now it landed differently, no longer complicated by uncertainty. And I met her gaze steadily as I replied that I had already made my decision, that I would continue to support my family in ways that were discussed openly and agreed upon honestly, but that I would not commit to something that had been assumed without my consent, and I kept my words simple, not adding explanation or apology, allowing them to stand as they were, and for a moment she did not respond, her composure holding but her stillness revealing more than her words might have, and then she gave a small nod, not of agreement but of acknowledgement, as if recognizing that this conversation was not going to resolve in the way she had anticipated. And without another word she turned and walked back toward the head table, her steps just as measured as before, her posture unchanged, and I watched her go only briefly before returning my attention to the table in front of me, aware that something fundamental had shifted between us, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not easily be undone, and as the reception continued around us, with laughter returning in cautious waves and music filling the spaces between conversations, I felt a quiet steadiness settle deeper within me. Not because everything had been resolved, but because for the first time in a very long while, I had chosen not to carry something that was never mine to begin with. The evening light began to soften as the sun moved lower over the water, casting long golden reflections across the edges of the tent and turning everything just slightly warmer, just slightly quieter, as if the day itself were beginning to exhale, and with that shift the reception moved into its next phase, the music growing more rhythmic, the tables slowly clearing as guests drifted toward the dance floor in small, tentative groups. And I remained seated for a while longer, watching the movement rather than joining it, not out of reluctance but because I wanted to observe what came next, to understand how the room would settle after what had already taken place. And I noticed that the earlier tension had not disappeared, it had simply changed shape, no longer centered entirely on me but dispersed into quieter conversations, into glances exchanged between guests, into the careful way certain topics were avoided while others were exaggerated to fill the space, and I saw Melissa stand from the head table, her posture still composed, her smile restored in a way that suggested determination rather than ease, and she moved through the crowd greeting guests, thanking them, maintaining the role she had stepped into earlier, and when her path brought her closer to table 7 she slowed slightly, her attention shifting toward me in a way that felt both deliberate and restrained, as if she were deciding in real time how to approach a situation that had not unfolded as expected, and for a brief moment I thought she might pass by without stopping. That she might choose to preserve distance rather than risk another public exchange. But then she turned, stepping toward me with the same controlled grace she had carried all day, and she greeted me softly, her tone polite, measured, as though we were simply two family members sharing a quiet moment at a celebration, and I returned the greeting with equal calm, either inviting nor rejecting what might follow, and she took a seat in the empty chair across from me, smoothing her dress as she settled, her hands resting lightly on the table as She looked at me with an expression that held both composure and something else beneath it, something more focused, more intentional, and she began by saying that she had not meant for things to become uncomfortable, that the day had been overwhelming, that so many details had come together at once, and that perhaps some assumptions had been made along the way, and I listened without interrupting. Recognizing the familiar structure of her words, the way responsibility was acknowledged but not fully claimed, the way the situation was softened into something that sounded almost accidental, and when she paused I responded simply, saying that I understood how stressful events like this could be, that planning a wedding involved many moving parts, but that clarity mattered, especially when it involved something as significant as a financial commitment, and I kept my tone steady, not confrontational, not dismissive, allowing the words to remain grounded in what had already been established, and she nodded slowly, her gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, and she said that she had believed it was already understood, that based on past support and previous conversations she had assumed I would want to contribute in that way, and I could see the sincerity in her expression, not necessarily in the assumption itself but in the belief that it was reasonable, and I realized then that this was not simply about intention but about expectation that had been reinforced over time until it felt unquestionable, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, maintaining the same calm presence I had carried throughout the day, and I told her that assumptions could feel true when they were repeated often enough, but that they were still assumptions, and that going forward anything of that nature would need to be discussed directly, without interpretation or expectation, and I watched as she absorbed that, her posture remaining composed but her expression shifting just enough to show that something had been reconsidered, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the sounds of music and laughter continuing around us, filling the space that our conversation did not occupy, and then she gave a small nod, not entirely in agreement but in acknowledgement, and she stood from the table, offering a brief, polite smile before moving back into the flow of the reception, and I remained where I was, aware that this exchange had not resolved everything but had clarified something essential, something that would carry beyond this day, and as I looked out toward the dance floor where guests were beginning to gather more freely, where the music had found a steady rhythm and the evening continued to unfold as if it had not been interrupted, I felt that same quiet steadiness within me deepen, not as a reaction to what had happened but as a recognition that I had stepped out of a pattern that no longer served me, and that whatever followed would no longer be shaped by silence or assumption, but by choices made openly and deliberately, one moment at a time. By the time the sky began to deepen into shades of blue and the first string lights flickered fully to life above the reception, the energy of the evening had settled into something softer, more contained, as if the day had quietly adjusted itself around what could not be undone, and I finally rose from my seat, not because I felt compelled to join the celebration in the way others had, but because I was ready to move on from the place where I had been sitting for so long, both physically and in a way that reached beyond the table itself, and I stepped out from beneath the tent, letting the cooler evening air meet my skin, the sound of the ocean more distinct now without the layers of conversation and music between us, and for a moment I simply stood there, looking out across the water as the last trace of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, and I realized how quiet it felt within me, not empty, not uncertain, but settled in a way I had not experienced in a long time, and I heard footsteps approach behind me, steady and familiar, and I did not need to turn to know it was Daniel, and he came to stand beside me without speaking at first, matching my stillness as we both looked out at the darkening line where the sea met the sky. And after a moment he said, in a voice that carried neither surprise nor doubt, that he was proud of me, and I let those words settle, not brushing them aside the way I might have before, but allowing myself to feel their weight, to recognize what they meant in the context of everything that had happened, and I turned slightly toward him, offering a small smile that did not need to be explained, because he understood without asking, and we stood there a little longer before returning inside. Not because anything required our presence but because leaving without acknowledgement would have felt incomplete, and as we stepped back into the reception space I noticed that the music had picked up again, guests now more fully engaged in dancing and conversation, the earlier tension faded into something less visible, though not entirely gone, and I saw my mother seated once more at the head table, speaking with a group of relatives, her expression composed as always. And when her gaze lifted and met mine across the room, there was no gesture, no attempt to signal or redirect, only a brief moment of recognition before she returned her attention to the conversation in front of her, and I understood then that whatever had been said earlier would not be revisited. Tonight, not openly, not in this setting, and that was all right, because the purpose of the day had shifted for me in a way that did not require further discussion to be complete, and I moved through the room with a quiet ease, offering polite smiles where appropriate, exchanging a few words with those who approached me with genuine warmth rather than curiosity. And when the time came for the final dances and the gradual winding down of the evening, I did not linger unnecessarily. I simply gathered my things, checking once to make sure I had everything I needed, and as I stepped away from table 7 for the last time, I paused briefly, looking at the place card I had earlier tucked into my clutch, taking it out for a moment and holding it between my fingers, and I thought about how something so small had come to represent so much, not because of where it had placed me, but because of what it had revealed. And without hesitation I set it back down on the table, not as a rejection, not as a statement, but as a simple act of leaving it behind, and then I turned and made my way toward the exit, Daniel walking beside me, his presence steady and familiar, and as we stepped out into the night air once more, the sound of the reception softened behind us, blending with the distant rhythm of the ocean, and I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the day settle into something that no longer pressed against me but rested quietly where it belonged, and I realized that what had changed was not just the outcome of a single moment, but the way I understood my place within the people and patterns that had shaped my life, and for the first time in many years, I did not feel the need to adjust myself to fit into that understanding. I simply accepted it as it was, and moved forward without carrying what was never mine to hold.